Well, good morning. The topic we have this morning is a very interesting topic. I personally manage about 10% as much money as the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and these issues of how do you do that efficiently, what sort of asset classes do you put it into, and how do you think about having some of the money try to serve a dual purpose is one that I think about all the time. The first thing I'd say is that Norway's fiscal management, where you put the money into the Sovereign Wealth Fund, is very much a best practice. It's a fantastic thing for future generations. And your basic policy of investing in a way that has very low overhead is also something I completely agree with. Of course, Norway, in addition to the Sovereign Wealth Fund, does a great job of being generous to the world, having the most generous development budget of any country in the world. And that's a fantastic thing. That's the area I spend my full-time work on, and understanding how to make aid effective is something the world gets smarter about all the time, and the relationship between Norway and my foundation is a very strong partnership where we're doing things together and learning. In terms of the investment fund, as we think about broadening the countries that you do investments in, I think it's important to think of two categories of countries. If you choose to broaden and invest in places like China, Mexico, Brazil, that would be purely for financial returns. That is, those what we often deem now middle-income countries are not so short of capital that a decision to invest in those countries would have a secondary effect of really improving their economies in a significant way. So it may be a wise thing to take your current geographic remit and look at those middle-income countries and possibly invest there. And there's a lot of growth in those countries, but given that it's no secret there's a lot of growth in the country, it doesn't mean that the assets are necessarily undervalued. But probably over time you are going to want to look at those geographies. The area where you may get this dual benefit is looking at investing in the low income, or sometimes they're called the low middle income, but I'll just say low income countries. And that would be the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, pretty much other than South Africa itself, and some of the countries in Asia. And in these countries, there is a shortage of capital. And the reason there's a shortage of capital is actually for a very explainable reason. There's enough political risk, enough challenge in investing in those countries that many pools of money stay away from going into those countries. However, for the countries involved, that creates a real problem. Because money is viewed as riskier, that means the interest rate that they pay, or the profit return that's expected for any project, is much, much higher. And so it means when you look at doing roads, railroads, electricity plants in these countries, the hurdle rate is so high that the project often doesn't get done. And so that's an asset class which could absorb, if it was well managed, something on the order of 10 billion additional dollars focused in that area. You would either have to hire experts in that area into your direct staff, which would raise your expenses somewhat, or you'd have to work through a manager who had deep expertise in that class. For most asset classes, you're able to do it with very low overhead. Here, because of the complexity involved, you'd have to accept either on a direct or indirect basis some degree of overhead. I personally think doing something like that with maybe you wouldn't start with 10 billion, maybe you'd start with a smaller number, but doing something like that I think would be a good thing. Of course, as a percentage of your total assets, I'm not talking about a gigantic amount, but in fact in Africa, unless we get these roads and the power and various things like that, there's a real limit to the type of growth that can be done there. There are other experts in this field that you'd want to partner with: World Bank, African Development Bank, the US IFC. In fact, all three of those are creating vehicles that are targeted towards these kind of infrastructure investments. A final area that our foundation gets involved in is actually going out and finding small and medium-sized companies who are building products, like particularly medical products or agricultural products, because that's the area that our foundation specializes in. And these are, there's a term for these called program-related investments. They're things where we may even buy equity in one of these companies or loan money at a certain interest rate to one of these companies to encourage them to make, say, drugs or vaccines at a very low cost for the poor countries. Another structure we've used is we've made big volume guarantees, but that would probably fit more on the grant side, the pure ODA side of your budget. But if it's equity investing, then it really is kind of in the middle, because you're serving an ODA type role that is improving human welfare and still trying to maintain the principle and the return on that. The total amount of money in this area where you can find drugs that would have these types of benefits, I expect there'll be several billion of investments like this. So again, on the scale of the size of your sovereign wealth fund, this is not a dramatic shift in money. There is some complexity to partition this out and find investors can do this. There's a thing called the Global Health Investment Fund that we just did recently in this area, where we raised several $100 million, and that will, for example, fund companies to do drugs for neglected diseases, fund companies to do drugs for malaria, and it should have a return, but it's a dual type instrument. It wouldn't be the investment you picked purely on a return basis. So I think in summary, you have a great approach, taking some portion of the funds and looking at infrastructure and health and other tools that can help the poorest. It's definitely a very timely question, because done well, you can get that dual benefit. As I invest as I said, $80 billion, it's a combination of personal money and foundation money. I have at this stage about $3 billion of that in these kind of dual goal type areas. So not a gigantic percentage, but enough that I'm hopeful it can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Then State Secretary Gunnar Pedersen.
Thank you. Of all the destinies that generations can choose to meet, our generation's destiny of being entrusted with a financial fortune unparalleled in Norway's history is an interesting one. The management of those resources, however, is clearly not just a responsibility for our own generation, but also for those who come behind us. In many aspects, Norway has a bipolar tradition of mixing megalomania and inferiority complexes. It's visible in several aspects of our national character. We have also a long tradition of focusing on symbols rather than results, on good efforts and kind intentions rather than hard evidence and firm measurement. And we're also 5 million people, though in our own debates we tend to forget that that's a small percentage of the world's population. It's not a massive number. Financial managers can be excellent, despite evidence to the contrary in recent financial upheavals, but they can be excellent at assessing risk and return, at ensuring diversification and balance, at hedging out undesirable exposures, and at locking in the value of various kinds of optionalities, be they technology, environment, geography, political options, geological options, or purely financial options. However, financial managers are not very good at assessing the impact of growth, and they can be pretty lousy at seeing what companies will be there tomorrow to replace those that they're enamored by today. For that, you need a different kind of manager. An entrepreneur rather than an accountant, a marketer, an inventor, a risk taker rather than just a risk manager. It's very difficult to build companies, to build organizations and environments in which all these kinds of splendid professionals work together. which is why the modern asset management organization has come into existence. The asset management organization doesn't necessarily need to employ entrepreneurs. It needs to employ someone who can find, manage, assess and diversify among large groups of entrepreneurs, among a whole slate of business opportunities, among the whole world's variety of regions, countries and markets. Come next spring, the government will initiate a discussion on the management of financial wealth in our government pension fund. There's no doubt in my mind that it will continue to be managed with strict guidelines on ethics, including social and environmental responsibility. But I also do not foresee the major point of its main goal being to maximize returns within an acceptable framework of risk being maintained. And I don't see a conflict between social responsibility and adequate return, nor does the government pension fund. It already has invested more than $5 billion US in Africa, for instance. There's no doubt that commercial investment will help accelerate development in poor countries. We've had enough large-scale experiments proving this, even having gone so far as to split countries into 2 Germanys and 2 Koreas to prove it. But there's also no doubt in my mind that a larger part of not only our own investments, but of all investments, will and should move into frontier markets with less developed markets and higher risks. Government investment agencies will be important partners in that for private sector investors who need someone's help, assistance, someone to piggyback with when trying to access these markets. We have one such in Norway already, Norfund, which provides a state-backed investor that can help carry along private investors, providing expertise and shielding them from certain political, legal, and other risks that private investors alone would be strongly subject to. Our own direct investments into emerging markets carry with them some aggregate risks and return requirements. The combinations may be different, but so do all investments. The longer we maintain that development goals create substandard returns, the longer we prevent government investment funds from being able to attract private investments along them in order to develop other economies. While government resources are significant, the private investment resources far outstrip the wealth of the international sovereign wealth funds. I don't know yet exactly what strategy we'll end up recommending and what strategy Parliament will choose for the government investments. We can choose to diversify resources to specific development goals and risk perhaps a lower return as a result of some strategy in some time perspective or for some portion of the fund. Or we can maximize returns and then use those returns to fulfill important investment goals. The way we spend money is as important as the way we invest money. In 2013, 4% return on the government pension fund was 158 billion kroner. In 2014, we anticipate that it will be 194 billion kroner. So the difference it makes, the difference a return can make, is also a difference in our ability to finance government expenditure, including development expenditure. I don't believe a single strategy is inherently ethically better than any other single strategy. On the contrary, I think the strategy should be analyzed from its ability to deliver results rather than purely from its intentions. And in both circumstances, I believe in giving clear, defined, measurable targets from the government as an owner and allowing investment professionals the freedom they need to deliver the goals we set. There are professionals working in Norway today, working in established government institutions, performing exactly these kind of investment tasks. These are already engaged in frontier markets on behalf of the Norwegian government, and I believe that they should have a wider scope and access to move funds from our own investments and into these development investments, which Mr. Gates talked so strongly about. Thank you.
Now, General Secretary Anne Marie Helland.
sure some of you are thinking, what on earth is this NGO lady doing here? And I'm about to explain that. In a rapidly changing world, rapidly changing, everything we knew about poverty and wealth in the world, rich countries, poor countries, everything has changed over the past few years. No actor, neither NGOs, private business, nor governments can afford no longer to think that business as usual is an option. We all need to think anew because the world is changing. We need to think outside the box and to look for win-win situations and opportunities for business and development. I have two main points to present to you today. Firstly, the Norwegian Pension Fund Global is Norway's biggest muscle abroad by far. And this gives us, of course, responsibilities, but also enormous opportunities. And secondly, investments can create both economic growth and jobs, and these things are absolutely crucial for development, both at micro and macro level. To look at structural constraints and injustice that developing countries face is a critical part of Norwegian Church Aid's mandate, NCA for short, from now on. In addition to issues such as better governance, transparency, financing for public provision of education and health, our work has led us to focus on an equally important constraint, namely the lack of appropriate forms and amounts of capital for things like hard infrastructure investments and for job creation, not the least, through small and medium-sized enterprises in developing countries. Most developing countries, except the likes of China, depend, they have a structural shortage of domestic savings and hence depend on external sources to get there. There's especially a lack of long-term capital and risk capital. In addition, illicit capital flights is a very serious problem for many countries. So we need to make money available and we need to make them stick. Since Norway happens to own the world's largest source of long-term risk capital, yes, we're a small country, but we do have the largest source, it made sense for us to have a closer look at what the fund could do. So we commissioned Sony Kapoor of Redefine to make this report for us. And the report makes a powerful case for why investing in unlisted growth equity and infrastructure in developing countries would be financially good for the oil fund and its final owners, namely us Norwegian citizens. The size of the funds means that it can handle political risk better than smaller funds. And as an endowment, it needs very little liquidity, as only 4% of the fund is supposed to be used every year. This allows it to be extremely long-term, and it is hence particularly well suited to invest in unlisted and illiquid assets such as development, energy, infrastructure, agriculture, green growth, etc. in developing countries. One example from Kenya, what private sector could do. Safaricom is a cell phone company in Kenya, and they have a service called M-Pesa, which is then mobile money. Everybody in Kenya has a cell phone. And now that through the banking system that Safaricom is earning a lot of money on, they can pay bills instantly instead of going long trips to the bank. Remittances are easily distributed. Business is made easier. Financial services are available for everybody. Safaricom makes money, and poor people saves money and time, and the speed of the economy goes up. It's estimated that 25% of Kenya's GDP is passing through this system. So it's a lot of money and it's a lot of activity. In investments can also create employment, obviously. The world needs jobs. 600 million new jobs are needed in the next 15 years just to maintain the current level of unemployment in the world. 600 million, imagine that. And most of these jobs are needed in developing countries, where there's also a huge generation of children now that are about to grow up to become youth that have to line up in the unemployment lines. Our oil fund could do massive changes here, contribute to millions of new jobs if correctly invested. Placing our money in developing countries is therefore also a good bet for the future. We could invest where the workforce is young and increasingly healthy and educated due to successful aid programs, and jobs are needed. We are extremely pleased, hence, that the new government, in their declaration, has promised to, quote, establish an investment program with the purpose of investing more in sustainable businesses in poor countries and emerging markets, unquote. So, to sum up, invest more in developing countries, first way. Second, be a responsible investor and search actively for win-win situations where profit and development can meet within the mandate of the fund. This is important. I have to stress that this done correctly could be a win-win for development and for Norway, saying that over and over again. We do not suggest turning the oil fund into development aid. We do not suggest that we should give away the oil fund. We do not suggest that we should invest the bulk of the oil fund in developing countries. But let's dare to go to 5% or 7% or 8%. That's what we're asking for. We strongly believe that there is a sound business case for the fund to invest more in developing countries in ways that would also be beneficial for development. We are used to placing NGOs, private sector and government into neat separate boxes. But in a rapidly changing world, these boxes don't fit anymore. So it's high time not only to think outside the box, but actually to dare to step outside the box and actually start doing something. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I will open the floor for questions now, and I will just pose a question that is both from our that we have prepared, and also a question from Facebook coming in the same line. These are that you could look into. In your opinion, what are the best investments you've seen in the past 10 years for development? And the question is, what's the single biggest investment we should be making that we aren't making, and why aren't we making it? So feel free to answer that challenge. Would you like to start, Gunnar? And then when he is talking and the panel is talking, you may sign up.
Well, probably the best investment I am aware of that, and now speaking as a representative of the government, that I've seen, is the investment in a Norwegian-owned company called SN Power. SN Power invests in hydroelectric energy and may also expand to some other energy resources in a variety of emerging markets across the world. It's a partnership between Norway and Statkraft, and has been widely successful in combining two main Norwegian interests. One is having money, and the second is having hydropower competence. There are many things in which we'd like to be world champions, but are not. However, hydropower is one area where we are a world power. We already own Europe's largest renewable energy company in Statkraft. And we probably have industrial ability to expand those investments abroad. To me, that's an example of how we can combine wealth and competence in a single investment.
Thank you. Would you like to continue, Anna Maria?
Yeah, in general, I would second what you said about SN Power. We also have quite a lot of experience with SN Power out in the country, and our country offices, and in general, those investments are quite interesting for us also from a development perspective. In general, I would say from a development perspective, in investments that create jobs, amounts of jobs, local jobs are very important. Access to energy is very important, and investments in agriculture is the single thing that really can lift people out of poverty. So to get the agricultural sector in developing countries growing is the most efficient way of actually combating poverty.
Thank you. Bill?
Well, the scale of money that you have is such that the vast majority, should be invested purely for a return basis. And it's great that you can be long-term, and it's great you figured out how to do that with a low fee structure so that you're basically riding along the full return of the different asset classes. Investments often in venture capital are involved in creating some of the breakthrough activities that define the digital world. However, there's not a shortage of money going into venture capital, so it's not as though Norway decided that was some privileged asset class. It would have some dramatic effect. Market capitalism does work very well for money to flow around. I'd say one of the more interesting companies I've seen recently that I put some money into is actually a private school in Kenya called Bridge International. And the government schools, unfortunately, are not very good. And so they created as low-cost school as they could, $5 a month. And they use a tablet computer approach. They train their teachers very well. So the quality of what they do is very, very high. And they're hoping to get to where they're about 4 or 5% of the children. Even more important, though, is that it would embarrass the public provider into doing something where the teacher's showing up and the structure of the lesson so that the actual learning results can be better there. So that's a case of the private sector setting an example and trying to scale up, and hopefully that affects the largest scale provider, which is the public provider.
Thank you. Norfund has been mentioned here, and I will now ask Kjell Ulam, the director of Norfund. He has a question here.
Thank you very much. Let me start by saying everything I've been hearing so far is music to my ear. I agree with all of it. The reason I would like to, the question I would like to have is basically to Bill Gates, and it's about the new asset class of impact investment. You explained that you are investing 3 billion already in this asset class. The problem we have with some of these investments is that the way management companies are structured. They basically copy private equity industry incentive structures, giving them bonuses and incentives to basically go after the financial returns. You're setting up investment structures with the aim of sort of having a balanced view on development and social impacts and an acceptable financial returns. But you basically ask the management of the companies to go after financial returns. The question is the following: it would be extremely useful if your foundation chose to take up a leading role in inventing new ways of organizing impact investments. Because what we see today is a lot of mission drift, that people, you set up companies with these dual purposes, and they start to drift immediately, and that's what I incentivize to do. So we need to think new. We need to organize these management companies differently and take it out of the private equity incentive-based space. Do you agree? And is that a role that Bill Gates Foundation could take going forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a direct question to you concerning if you want to do an initiative like Norfund here is explaining.
Yeah, it's a very good point. When you think of who are these people that are managing, say, an African infrastructure fund or health investments where you're trying to make sure products for the poorest, or agricultural investments where you're trying to help out the poorest. They actually have to be as smart as the best sort of Wall Street finance people to know the numbers very well. And they have to be even a little smarter than that because they have to understand this other measure. They have to know the domain very, very well. But if you're not careful, the incentives to them will purely be the financial returns. And of course, if you don't pick the right people, they're going to say, well, I'm going to quit because I could make more money working for a hedge fund, private equity fund. So you almost need people who've chosen to exercise their skills without being paid the maximum market amount of money. And that's another reason why scaling these things up, you know, even if you're going into these areas, the idea that you wouldn't just immediately be able to take tens of billions of dollars and put them into these new classes, that would be very difficult. Your question about our role, we are looking at, in the health area, creating a few $1 billion worth of such opportunities where we manage them carefully to make sure they meet the dual goal. The other area that we're likely to come up with something like that is in African agriculture. And there I think, again, we could come up with 2 to 5 billion. African infrastructure, which we won't directly get into because others are in it, is the other one. And that's the one where the numbers could be a bit larger. And I should understand what Norfund's already doing in that area. But I do think, you know, that one, you could get up to tens of billions if it was done well.
Thank you. We have enough questions, so I have closed the list. But then Sophie Mathiasen in the Business Journal of Norway.
We hear a lot about how much good investments can do in poor countries. And
Could you speak a little louder, please?
We hear about all the positive benefits that investment can make in poor countries. But would it be advisable to take some spend of aid and transfer to investments, or what's most important, aid or investments?
Then is aid or investment the most important thing? And that probably is a question to all of you. Would you like to start, Anna Maria?
Well, first of all, aid is already invested. I mean, the investments in the money that Norfund is spending is already development aid, and they have been increased for very good reasons. But I think if you talk about scale, this is about thinking in or outside the box, because why do we always think that when it comes to money spent in developing countries, it has to be aid money? Why do we not see these places in the world as emerging markets where it's actually possible to make money? Because it is. And the problem with aid money is always when you go in with aid money, you think that profit might not be part of it. If you go in as business, you go in as business, and that's actually what Africa needs. They need business.
Yes, Bill?
Yeah, I'd say aid is far more important. You have to remember, we invented economics to improve human welfare. And so when children are dying of measles, when they're dying of diarrhea, when they're dying of pneumonia, the way that impacts the mother, you can't put a number figure on that. And the Norwegian aid budget, which is very generous as a percentage of your economy, is very small compared to this investment fund we're talking about. I mean, it's like $5.5 billion a year. You're saving, by buying vaccines, by helping invent new seeds, you're saving millions of lives. And as people get richer, they can move from not just caring about themselves, their family, their community, their country, but care about all of humanity. And I'm lucky enough to be rich, so I can take my resources to all of humanity. Norway, by many measures, is one of the richest countries in the world, and so you can afford to take some of that money and help out people in other places. And so the aid you're doing is improving the world and changing the world. Because of your wealth, you can be generous. Your capital as a percentage of the world's capital is a much smaller percentage than your aid is a percentage of the world's aid. But they're both very important, and you're doing a good job on both.
Thank you. Gunnar?
Sorry. I think we're onto something, because risk is not something that's associated with low-income countries alone, of course. The sovereign wealth fund has lost much more money in the United States than any other place on earth. It's also earned more money in the United States than any other place on earth over time, simply because the US is the world's largest economy. However much we invest in infrastructure abroad, and we will invest in roads, in mobile systems, in banks, and other kinds of private and public infrastructure, I fully agree that the main investment will have to be in people, in ensuring that they survive and ensuring that they qualify. If we look at our own national wealth, we sometimes get impressed by the numbers of the sovereign wealth fund, but our own national wealth is mainly derived from the labor force, and the net present value of our current labor force is many times larger than the value of the bank investment fund. That's the same situation in every country on earth. The most important part of any economy is its labor force and the people living in that country. So ensuring that they get good education and that they survive is the most important financial investment anyone can do in any country.
Thank you. Christian Riber?
Thank you. I would like to ask Mr. Gates if you could comment on the issue of CSR when doing your investments in these countries, in infrastructure, in commercial, and even in vaccination programs. You will obviously come across many dilemmas in terms of CSR, labor rights, children work, even bribery. What are your principles and considerations when trading off these two issues? Thank you.
Yes, that question is clear. Yes.
Yeah, I think most corporate behavior is controlled by the laws of the country involved, and making sure these countries develop so that they have better laws and enforce their laws better. That's a real goal of development. So in investments, there are categories you can choose not to invest in. I don't happen to invest in tobacco companies. There were some companies involved in business in Sudan, so there was a list created that some investors chose to stay away. It wasn't a gigantic list. So we have some things we don't invest in. Then when we have companies that we own more than 5% of the company, or there's a shareholder vote in any of our companies, we sit and talk about those votes. So for example, there have been proxy votes about treating gay employees equally to non-gay employees, and we voted differently than management recommended on that social issue. But we look through the various proxy things to make sure that we're being a responsible owner there. The biggest thing our foundation does is take companies in the industries we have expertise, the agricultural companies and the drug companies. And actually in the drug companies, we do a rating every year called the Access to Medicine Index that shows which of the drug companies are really helping out with poor country medicines through either research or donations. And it's been great because the companies compete to be highly ranked. When they're recruiting employees, they talk about that rating. And the companies have moved up. GSK and Sanofi have stayed up high, but some of the ones more at the bottom have moved up a fair bit. And I'm talking to the CEOs of pharma companies every month asking, hey, we need your expertise here. Would you please donate this here? We're doing the same now with food companies. We're doing the same with mobile phone companies for things like getting them to type things into other countries. That was a great example of a great infrastructure. But we don't have some gigantic list of things we ban. There was an article attacking the foundation like 6 years ago in a US newspaper that said we invested in banks and those banks were foreclosing loans that they shouldn't. We invested in Ford Motor and they had some factory site they hadn't cleaned up. My view is that is up to the government to deal with those things. We have a fairly narrow list in terms of where we won't invest at all.
Thank you. Then Maria Reinertsen, a journalist.
Yes, question for Mr. Gates. As I already said, the oil fund is supposed to set up an investment mandate investing in developing countries and emerging markets more directly than they do today. And I wonder how important it is that the companies that they invest in and create pay their taxes in the countries where they invest. And the reason why I'm asking is that the oil fund today quite openly admits that they engage in tax planning when managing the rest of their portfolio there. For example, when managing their real estate investments in Europe, they do that through a series of companies in Luxembourg. So I wonder how important it is to pay taxes.
Yes. That question is, do you look into tax issues when you invest in developing countries' businesses? And I can follow up that with a question from Twitter. That is, how can we best know that we are not supporting bribery or illegal organizations when making investments in the third world? So those are two things that comes a little together, and I would like the whole panel to answer this. And Maria first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think this is an area, when it comes to tax and transparency and all, this is really an area where we have to look at what, the situation from the various actor side. We need to cooperate here between the various actors, because this is exactly an area where civil society and Norwegian government bilateral aid to governments can actually play a major role in securing the investments that you are doing, because Norwegian development aid could and is helping developing countries build a tax sector, for example, helping them to put up systems for how to collect taxes. Then Tanzania is an example of that. And then Norwegian Church Aid is given funds to do budget monitoring. So we are training local organizations to actually monitor budget, to secure that the tax money that comes in is actually distributed. So to mobilize Tanzanian civil society on that. And that is one example where you really have to make things pull in the same direction. But tax is a really major issue, because there's a lot more money going out of developing countries in the form of illicit capital flight than development aid coming in. So in that sense, development aid is now only sort of the band-aid to fill up the quota that left in terms of capital flight.
Thank you. Bill?
Yeah, however, it is very strange that international tax rules are so complex that people who are smart about minimizing taxes can end up paying less taxes than people might expect. And I think here, as long as people are transparent about what they do, then the people who make the tax rules have to sit and look at that and decide, you know, should these Netherlands Antilles or, various tax structures, should those, should that be the way it's done? There is a move afoot to make things, to force things to be more transparent, to have less anonymous organizations. But basically, as long as you're being transparent and following the law, the fact that the fund doesn't go out of it, uses tax minimization structures, that seems perfectly fair to me. Only if it was hidden or illegal would I think that something was inappropriate there.
Thank you. Gunnar?
At least two tenets I've been taught when entering the Ministry of Finance. The first one is that we don't do deficits. That's something republics and others do. And the second is that the Ministry of Finance believes that everyone should pay their taxes. When it comes to tax structures internationally, it's clearly something which needs international solutions, international cooperation. And I also believe that not only developing and low-income countries, but also modern economies have large challenges and still many steps ahead of them in these aspects. We demand many low-income countries, we expect them to have, for instance, highly sophisticated systems in place to protect themselves against transfer pricing, which is a huge international tax issue, which creates many problems. Whereas most modern countries, most industrial countries, haven't solved tax issues associated with transfer pricing yet. So we cannot set standards to other countries which we cannot expect to live by ourselves. International tax is one of the huge development issues still to be tackled on an international basis. There are many national inconsistencies to be handled, and it's an area which this government where this government will continue the work of the previous government and increase the efforts on ensuring a more fair international tax system.
Thank you. I have two questions over here. First, you. Yes.
Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation. This is a question from Mr. Gates with the panelists welcome to answer.
Speak up loud, please.
Okay. As one of the world's most richest countries, what sort of moral obligation do you think Norway has? And what does that moral obligation call on us to contribute with?
The first question here is about moral obligation of Norway, and then secondly, there is a lady just sitting there. Yes.
From the Norwegian Business Daily. My question is somewhat similar. Do we have a moral obligation as being one of the richest countries? This is also from Mr. Gates, the panelist, welcome to answer as well. And how much should we expect on return from investments? Because earlier today you said that one should think of the return of the investment when one invests. And how much should we consider that when we invest, and why?
Yes, those questions were in the same line, coincidentally. Yeah. Bill Gates.
Well, Norway's a democracy, and so I think the decision about how generous to be to the world, your democratic process will make that decision. some of the voters will have religious convictions. Some voters will have actually been out in Africa and see what can be done, and understand how your situation is really an amazing one, and have sympathy for those who don't have nearly as much. I think it's fantastic the way that's come out, as that you've chosen to be the most generous of any country, and you put a lot of energy into making sure that that money is well spent. And that's, my real knowledge of the Norway is not so much the investments in the sovereign wealth fund, but much more the grant money that goes out through that development aid budget. And I can say, that is money that's well spent, and we're getting smarter every year. So I don't, however you come to that logic, at the end of the day, through the voters, you've picked some of the same things that our foundation has picked, and that's a great thing. It's an amazing thing that humans choose to be generous in that way, and Norway's at the front of it.
Thank you. Gunnar?
I would just add that I don't believe moral obligation is something that's associated only with the size of the sovereign wealth fund. These moral obligations would apply to us whether we had the fund or not. We are a wealthy country and we have certain competences, and it's a moral obligation, whether you're rich or poor, to ensure that your resources are spent well and that you assist those who are less fortunate than yourself. That moral obligation is immaterial, irrespective of whether our oil fund is large or small.
Thank you. Anna Maria?
Yeah, it's a bit weird that I'm the one. Yeah, I mean, yes, moral obligation. Of course, NCA, that, yes, for us, moral obligation. However, in addition to that, it's strange that I am the one to mention it, but in addition to that, the planet is one. I mean, what do we think will happen to our economy if we have 600 million more unemployed youth in the world? In Africa, where will they go? They will come to Europe. What will that do to the European economy? I mean, it's about looking at the global as one. What will it do to global security, the increasing inequalities in the world? So we have to think that we need someone to trade with also in this country. We need people to do business with. And this is reality. But moral obligation, yes, yes.
Thank you. That was a good comment from the Norwegian Church Aid. I also had two questions over here. First, James Stover-Lunchen, politician.
James Stover-Lunchen. First of all, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us, and thank you for the fantastic work you're doing. You mentioned already, I had to change my question because you preempted me a little bit. You said you would not invest in infrastructure power generation because others are doing it. But in Africa and in Cambodia and other countries, there's a big problem. Billions of people are collecting firewood, using charcoal, and they are burning poor kerosene. And this creates huge problems, health problems. So I'm not talking about CO2 and global warming, but there's a problem with local pollution, domestic pollution, people dying from lung emphysema, whatever it is. So the question is, today there are a lot of technical solutions. Local small solar panel power plants, small hydro thermal energy, small wind farms. And these can be very well managed in a local net, in the small local remote areas. So I wonder if this is an area you have looked into, because this is health, it's energy for driving telephones and PCs and electric light for students to study. So is this an area that borders on your area, and have you analyzed this, and is this of interest?
Thank you. That is also in line with several Twitter questions. They are asking if energy needs of developing countries can be met by cheap renewable energy. And then another question here first.
This is a very tiny, small question. My name is Njal Hestmalingen. I'm from International Law and Policy Institute, and it's a little weird, but since these investments are already are kind of ethical, would from the Norwegian government side, and maybe also from the Bill Gates Foundation side, would you be accepting a lower ethical standards when it comes to human rights and environmental protection, anti-corruption, etc.? So for these new and emerging markets, should we accept some kind of a different standard than for the markets we already are investing in?
That was a question about moral standards and other standards, if they should be different in developing countries than we put on in our own country. So first, maybe the energy question. Bill?
Okay. Well, renewable energy is not cheap. I mean, people want it to be cheap, but it's not cheap. Building a coal plant to generate energy is the cheapest way in most geographies, including in China today. That is the cheapest way to make energy. Now, it has two very serious externalities. It has local air pollution, and it has global greenhouse gas, CO2 type pollution. And we're all concerned. The local government should be particularly concerned about the first, and everybody in the world should be concerned about the second. Whenever we think about power, we always have to think about reliable power, 24-hour-a-day power. Intermittent power is essentially of no value, unless you're like an aluminum plant, you can turn it on, turn it off. But what humans need, the hospital, reading at night, you need constant power. And so the breakthroughs in energy that will give us low-cost power, those are very important. And there are a lot of great technology companies. I'm invested in many of them that will give us low-cost power. The lowest cost power will be large-scale power, where you have a big generation plant and a grid. Local grids, because they can't spread across many users and the variation in users, will never be as economic as a large grid. And building grids in Africa is another infrastructure piece that needs to get done. And so we need to get electricity to Africa. It is not the most important thing. We need to get the childhood death rates down. We need to get the nutrition up. The greatest tragedy is that so many of the kids, because they don't get good nutrition, their brain never fully develops. And so you really can't develop an economy when you have nutrition that's that bad. The main health effect, there's two health effects of pollution. One is outdoor air pollution, which is like a nearby coal plant. The worst in these countries is indoor air pollution, where you're burning in a stove and it generates, it's actually not well understood which chemicals are bad, but it does cause respiratory disease. So giving people new stoves has been one of those goals, but that's actually, so far that hasn't been very successful because it doesn't cook their food to taste the same way, and it's not very inexpensive. But there's we have a lot of grants out to try to solve that indoor air pollution problem.
Thank you. We have time for very short comments, and I will start with Gunnar to finalize the meeting.
No, just on the last issue of ethical standards, I think for a sovereign wealth fund managed by a democratic mandate, there's only one solution, and that is to apply the same standards everywhere in the world. I don't think that any other approach is viable long term, and given the need to maintain political support for the sovereign wealth fund.
Thank you. And Maria?
This is a bit odd again, but yes, I also think that, of course, in terms of ethical standards, they are extremely important. But I think in reality, requiring that a small to medium-sized company in Malawi is supposed to have the same perfect standards before you go in to invest is actually to ask too much. So maybe we have to follow sort of a principle of continuous improvement and have, of course, control and monitoring over that.
Thank you. And then Bill, a final comment.
Yeah, different governments have different things. I mean, obviously people disagree with the U.S. government. The U.S. government goes to war at various times, it makes mistakes at various times. The biggest holding in my portfolio is U.S. Treasury bonds. The biggest holding in Norwegian sovereign fund is U.S. Treasury bonds. So you do invest, you invest in the Middle East, and the way they treat women is not yet, what we should expect it will be. And so you do business on a worldwide basis. Sometimes a country will do something that's extreme enough that you really do want to withdraw your investments. And I think having a community of investment groups that look at this stuff together. Universities do this, some of the endowment funds do this together. And so we're not creating some huge infrastructure that we're a parallel justice system, and yet we're in touch with each other about how do you look at these issues. I do think that's valuable, because there are extreme cases where even the investment behavior should change.
Thank you very much. Then a big applause for the panel.